The paramedic said my heart stopped twice in the parking lot of St. Andrews. I don't remember any of it. I remember singing. We were halfway through the second hymn, the one about still waters, and I felt this pressure in my chest like someone had placed a flat iron right over my sternum. I thought I was just tired. I'd been tired a lot that winter. I told myself it was the cold, the dry air, the fact that I hadn't been sleeping well since Gerald passed 18 months before. Then I woke up in a hospital bed in Sudbury with a tube down my throat and a nurse named Patricia holding my hand. She had kind eyes. That's the first thing I noticed. Brown, steady, patient. She squeezed my fingers and said, "You're okay, Margaret. You're at Health Sciences North. You've been here since Sunday." It was Wednesday. 3 days. I had lost 3 days of my life, and I didn't know it. Patricia explained what happened slowly, the way you explain things to someone who might not fully understand, and I suppose I didn't. Not yet. Cardiac arrest in the parking lot. A man named Dennis, someone from the congregation I'd never properly spoken to, had started CPR before the ambulance arrived. He'd kept me alive for 11 minutes until the paramedics took over. 11 minutes. A stranger's hands on my chest for 11 minutes. I lay there listening, and the first thing I thought, the very first thing before I even felt afraid or grateful or anything else, was, where is my son? His name is Trevor. He's 41 years old. He lives in Oakville, about 4 hours south, with his wife Diane and their 2 kids. He works in commercial real estate. He drives a very nice truck. He calls me on my birthday and at Christmas, and sometimes on Mother's Day, though not always. I asked Patricia where he was. She paused. Just a small pause, the kind a person makes when they're deciding how much to tell you. "We've been trying to reach your emergency contact," she said carefully. "We've left several messages. I asked how many. She looked at the chart. The nursing station tried 31 times over the first 2 days. The social worker on call tried another 9. Dr. Mercedes. Okafor's office made contact attempts as well. 43 times. My son's phone rang or received a message 43 times while I was in a coma, and he had not called back once. I didn't cry. I think I was too tired to cry, and maybe part of me had already known, somewhere underneath everything, that this was who Trevor had become. Or maybe who he had always been, and I had simply refused to see it for a very long time. I asked Patricia for some water. She brought it. I drank it slowly, and I looked out the window at the February sky, that particular shade of grey you only get in northern Ontario in winter, heavy and close and absolute. There was a thin strip of birch trees visible from my bed. Their white bark looked almost luminous against the dark sky. I thought about Gerald, about how he used to say, "Maggie, you make excuses for that boy that he doesn't deserve." And I always told him he was wrong, that Trevor just needed time, needed space, needed us to stop hovering. He was busy. He had a life. You couldn't expect your adult children to check in every week, like it was 1987. Gerald died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in October. Trevor came to the funeral. He stayed for 4 hours and then drove back to Oakville because Diane had a work thing that couldn't be moved. I told myself it was fine. Patricia came back that evening and sat with me for a while after her shift technically ended. She didn't have to do that. I want to say that clearly. She had her coat on and her bag over her shoulder, and she came back anyway and pulled a chair up next to my bed and just sat there while I stared at the ceiling. "Do you have anyone else?" she asked. Not unkindly, just directly, the way nurses learn to be when they've seen enough of life to know that directness is often kinder than softness. I thought about it. My sister Lorraine lives in Victoria and has her own health problems. My friend Bev from church had her hip replaced in January and couldn't travel. My neighbour Ruth Kowalski, who has lived next door to me for 19 years and who once drove me to the emergency room at midnight when I had a kidney stone. Ruth didn't know I was in the hospital because nobody had called her. I asked Patricia if someone could call Ruth. Ruth arrived the next morning at 7:30 with a container of homemade borscht that the nurses politely told her she couldn't give me yet, and she sat in the chair next to my bed and held my hand without saying anything for a very long time. Ruth is not an effusive woman. She is 72 years old and grew up in a Ukrainian household in Timmins, where you showed love by showing up, not by talking about showing up. She just showed up. That afternoon, my phone, which a nurse had retrieved from my coat pocket, finally rang. It was Trevor. "Mom." His voice was tight, controlled. The voice he uses when he's been caught doing something and is trying to get ahead of it. "I just heard. I'm so sorry. We were in Cancun. Diane had booked it back in November as an anniversary trip, and the resort had really limited cell service, so I wasn't getting notifications properly." I let him talk. He talked for quite a while. He mentioned the cell service 3 more times. He mentioned how worried Diane had been when they finally got the news. He mentioned that the kids sent their love. He asked how I was doing in the same tone you use when asking how someone's commute was. I said I was recovering. He said he was relieved. I said that was good. There was a silence then. One of those silences that stretches and exposes everything underneath it. And into that silence, Trevor said, "I'll try to come up next weekend if things settle down." If things settle down. I had a cardiac arrest. I was in a coma for 3 days. I was 63 years old and alone in a hospital bed in Sudbury, and my son was going to try to visit if things settled down. I said, "That's okay, Trevor. Don't worry about it." I meant it. That's the part I need you to understand. I wasn't being passive-aggressive or martyred or any of the things he later accused me of being. I genuinely meant it. Because in that moment, something in me became very quiet and very clear. The way the air gets clear after a heavy snow, clean and still and final. I didn't need him to come. I had Ruth. What I didn't know yet was what Trevor had been doing while I was unconscious. I found that out slowly over the weeks that followed, the way you find out most things that hurt you, in pieces, not all at once. It started with my financial advisor, a man named Alan Mercer at the TD branch in Sudbury, where I've had my account since Gerald and I were first married. Alan called me about 6 weeks after I came home from the hospital, very professionally, very carefully, to ask whether I had authorized Trevor to make inquiries about my investment portfolio. I had not. Alan, to his credit, had not given Trevor any information privacy regulations, he explained. But also, he said, and I could hear the careful delicacy in his voice, he had wanted to speak with me directly first because some of the questions Trevor had been asking were quite specific, about the value of my REF, about the cottage in Magnituan, about whether I had a will on file and who had been named executor. Gerald and I had bought that cottage in 1991. We'd spent every summer there for 22 years. It was where we taught Trevor to fish, where we scattered wildfire seeds along the shoreline every spring, where Gerald and I used to sit on the dock after the kids. There had been a daughter too, Joanna, who died at 4 from leukemia, before Trevor was born, where we used to sit on the dock and watch the sun go down over the water and not have to say anything at all. The cottage was worth somewhere around $380,000 now, maybe more depending on the market. The house in Sudbury was worth just under $500,000. Gerald's life insurance had been substantial. I was not a wealthy woman by some standards, but I was comfortable, more than comfortable. And my son, while I was unconscious and the hospital was calling his phone for the 3rd and 4th and 20th and 40th time, had been making inquiries about what he stood to inherit. I sat in my kitchen after Alan's call, and I drank a cup of tea, and I looked out at the backyard, at the bird feeder Gerald had built the winter before he died, and I thought about every excuse I had made for Trevor over 40 years. The time he didn't come home from university for Christmas because his girlfriend's family was more fun. The time he didn't show up at his father's retirement party because of a work trip he'd supposedly forgotten was scheduled. The way he'd never once called Gerald just to talk. Only ever when he needed something or wanted to establish that he'd been in touch. The way he'd stood at Gerald's funeral with his jaw set and his eyes dry and his phone in his hand, checking messages. I had told myself he was just a certain kind of person, private, not demonstrative. A lot of men are like that, I said to Lorraine once. He loves us in his way. But his way had left me alone in a coma for 3 days while he took photos by a resort pool. I called my lawyer, a woman named Helen Park, who has handled my and Gerald's affairs for 15 years, and I made an appointment. Helen is 67 herself, recently widowed, not given to sentimentality. When I sat across from her desk and told her everything, the hospital, the 43 calls, Cancun, the inquiries to Alan at TD, she listened without interrupting, and then she nodded once, slowly, and said, "Right, let's talk about what you want." What I wanted was actually very simple. I wanted to stop pretending. I wanted to stop building my calendar around phone calls that exhausted me. I wanted to stop bracing every time I saw his name on my screen, because I could never tell if he was calling because he cared or because he needed something. I wanted to stop feeling like a fool for hoping every single time that this time would be different. I also wanted the cottage to go to someone who would actually use it. That someone was my niece, Carla. She's Lorraine's youngest daughter, 35 years old, lives in Ottawa, comes up to Sudbury twice a year just to see me. She's the one who drove 14 hours round trip to help me clean out Gerald's workshop the spring after he died, who sat on the floor with me surrounded by his old fishing lures and woodworking tools and just let me talk for hours. She'd always loved the cottage. As a little girl, she'd called it the lake house and talked about it like it was a fairy tale place. I told Helen to put the cottage to Carla. I told her to put the house and the remaining assets into a trust overseen by Helen herself, with distributions to a few charities Gerald and I had always supported. The cancer ward at Health Sciences North, the food bank in Sudbury's East End, the little library foundation in Magnetawan that operated out of a converted church hall. Trevor would receive from my estate my late mother's china set, the one he'd always ignored, and Diane had once described as a lot of fuss for dishes nobody uses and a cashier's check for $1,000. It felt, actually, quite generous. Helen reviewed everything, asked me twice if I was sure, and when I said yes both times, she said, "All right then," and started drafting. I didn't tell Trevor. I saw no reason to. He had not, in the months since the hospital, come to Sudbury to visit. He had called 4 times. Brief calls, all of them feeling like obligations being discharged. He had sent a card for my birthday in March, a generic one, the kind you grabbed from a rack near a pharmacy checkout without thinking, signed just Trevor and Diane. Not even the kids' names. Ruth came for dinner every Thursday. Carla drove up for a long weekend in April, and we opened the cottage early and sat on the dock in our winter coats because it was still barely above freezing and she didn't care at all. She brought coffee in a thermos, and we sat there looking at the lake, and she said, "Aunt Margaret, I want you to know that whatever you need, I'm here." Not because of anything, I think, just because she meant it. Dennis, the man from the congregation who had done CPR in the parking lot, turned out to be a retired electrician named Dennis Halverson who'd lost his wife 2 years prior. We started having coffee after the Sunday service. He was quiet and decent and occasionally very funny in a dry, sideways way that reminded me a little of Gerald. I did not think about that too hard. In June, Trevor called. He had, apparently, been talking to someone at TD. He hadn't been able to get information, but he'd heard, through some channel I never fully traced, that I had been in to see Helen. "Mom," same tight voice, "I heard you met with your lawyer." "I do meet with my lawyer occasionally, yes." Can I ask why? I was updating some documents. A pause. What kind of documents? Estate planning. At my age, after what happened in February, it seemed prudent. Another pause, longer this time. I just want to make sure you're making decisions clearly, that you're not being influenced by anyone. There it was. I had been waiting for it, I realized. Some part of me had been expecting exactly this framing, not concern for me, but the suggestion that any decision I made that didn't benefit him must be the result of someone else's manipulation. I'm making decisions very clearly, Trevor, I said. I've been making them clearly for 63 years. Diane and I have been worried about you. We've been talking about whether you should be living alone up there. That's kind of you, I said. I'm doing well. Mom. His voice shifted then, softer, the voice I remembered from when he was small and wanted something. I know I wasn't there in February. I know it looked bad, but I didn't know. The service was genuinely terrible at that resort, and I've been feeling terrible about it. I really have. I believed, actually, that some part of him felt something about it. Not enough to have driven to Sudbury in the 5 months since, but something. I know it was complicated, I said. I want to do better. I'd like to come up. Maybe this summer before you open the cottage. The cottage is already open, I said. Carla and I opened it in April. A silence. Carla. Yes. She came up for a long weekend. It was lovely. I didn't explain anything else. I let the silence do the work the way it always should have been allowed to do, instead of me filling it with reassurances and excuses, and the insistence that everything was fine. He said he would call me next week to plan a visit. He did not call the next week. He called 6 weeks later, in August, and this time Diane was on the call too, speakerphone, and they talked about coming for Thanksgiving. I said that sounded fine. It was a short call. When I hung up, I sat for a moment in the kitchen, and I realized I felt almost nothing. Not the braced anticipation I used to feel before his calls, not the deflated disappointment after. Just a mild, quiet neutrality, like hearing a weather forecast for a city you no longer live in. Ruth came for dinner that Thursday. We made pierogies from scratch because she'd been teaching me for 2 years and I still couldn't get the dough thin enough to her satisfaction. We argued companionably about the thickness of the dough for an hour and then ate them with sour cream and fried onions and watched a nature documentary about the boreal forest, which made Ruth cry a little because she said the caribou looked lonely. Carla texted to say she'd found an old photo of Gerald and me at the cottage from 1994, the summer she was 4 years old and visiting with Lorraine. In the photo, Gerald is holding a fish he'd just caught, grinning like a man who has just won something, and I am laughing at him, and the lake is behind us, and the light is exactly the long golden late afternoon light of a northern Ontario summer. She'd had it printed and framed. She asked if she could bring it up at Thanksgiving. I told her yes, of course, and then I sat with my phone in my hand for a long moment in the kitchen where Gerald had built the shelves and Dennis had recently fixed the light fixture over the sink, and I thought about how grief and gratitude can live in the same place in you at the same time without either one cancelling the other out. I thought about the parking lot of St. Andrews, about Dennis's hands keeping my heart going for 11 minutes while I was somewhere else entirely, in whatever quiet place a person goes when their body decides it needs to stop for a while. I thought about what I came back to, Ruth's borscht, Carla's thermos of coffee on a freezing dock in April, Alan Mercer's careful phone call, Helen Park's steady voice saying, "Right, let's talk about what you want." I thought about what I had let go of and how little it weighed now that I'd put it down. Outside, a chickadee landed on Gerald's bird feeder, pecked twice at the seed, then flew off into the birch trees, quick and purposeful and entirely unaware of being watched. I poured the rest of my tea down the sink, rinsed the cup, and started getting ready for church. There's something nobody tells you about a cardiac arrest, not the medical part, but the after. The moment you realize that the crisis itself wasn't the hardest thing. The hardest thing was the quiet that followed, and what became visible inside that quiet. I think about the parking lot of St. Andrews sometimes, about Dennis, a man I'd barely spoken to, keeping my heart beating for 11 minutes with his bare hands, and about Trevor, 4 hours south, whose phone rang 43 times while I was somewhere between here and gone. Those two facts sit side by side in me now, and I've stopped trying to make them fit into a story that excuses one of them. What I've come to understand is that the way people behave when you're not watching, when there's no social occasion, no audience, no reward in sight, that's the truest information you will ever receive about them. Trevor didn't fail me in a moment of weakness or confusion. He made a series of choices, each one small enough to explain away, that added up to something I could no longer look past. Recognizing that wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is a form of self-respect that takes years to earn. I spent a long time being what I'd call loyal in the wrong direction, toward a version of my son I'd constructed out of hope and selective memory, rather than toward the evidence in front of me. That's not a moral failure. I think most parents do it. But there comes a point where continuing to look away isn't love anymore. It's just fear dressed up as patience. Real moral courage, the kind that actually costs something, is being honest about what you see, even when what you see is someone you raised. The decision I made with Helen wasn't about punishment. I want to be clear about that. Even now, it was about alignment, about making sure the things I'd built over a lifetime went toward people who had shown, in the plainest and most unglamorous ways possible, that they could be trusted with them. Ruth showing up with borscht. Carla driving 14 hours to sit on a floor with me. Dennis Halvorson's hands. Those weren't grand gestures. They were just people being decent when it was inconvenient. And that is, I've decided, the only measure of character that means anything. The intelligence part. And I don't mean cleverness. I mean the kind of honest thinking that refuses to comfort itself with convenient stories. That part took me the longest. I was 63 years old before I stopped explaining Trevor's behavior in ways that protected my own feelings rather than reflected the truth. That's a long time. But I don't think the timing disqualifies the learning. You understand things when you're ready to live with what the understanding costs you. And the persistence, getting up from that hospital bed, calling Alan, calling Helen, sitting across from Ruth on Thursday evenings and learning to make pierogies whose dough was still, frankly, a little too thick, that's not dramatic resilience. It's just the ordinary stubbornness of continuing, choosing day after day to be more interested in the life in front of you than in the wound behind you. The cottage is still there. The birch trees along the shoreline are already turning, I'm told, earlier than usual this year. Carla says she's coming up in October. She wants to see the colors from the dock. I told her to bring the thermos.